Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. The next hour is devoted to learning something more, not just about the world of shoes and ships and sealing wax, but about how, what, and why we believe as we do. A time for the open-minded and a time for those willing to question what they think they know or what they may believe, those willing to be uncertain for an hour. I'm Eldon Taylor, and this is Provocative Enlightenment. All right, my partner Ravinder is here in the studio with me, so Rav, say hello to everyone and share your insight for the day.
My insight for the day, actually, I tend to think life is a journey and you keep on working on stuff. So is there new insight for today? No, I'd say keep working at it. Don't quit. Always strive to be better. Always strive higher. I think one of my favorite books is Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I think there's a lot to be learned in that. Don't be put off by what people say. Keep striving higher for yourself.
All right, that's it. That's a good point. Now, we have a special show today in my mind. This show is actually incubated for quite some time. You and I have had some significant differences about what goes on in the view of that people hold about law enforcement or that law enforcement holds about people. Are you excited about today's show?
I am looking forward to today's show. I always like people who couldn't possibly offer solutions. And I think your guest today does have some. He's not firmly in either camp. At least that's my understanding so far. So no, I'm hopeful.
Well, we'll flesh that out. We had lunch today, and there were several officers there. And you know that whenever I see police officers, I make it a point to go thank them for what they do. But I know what the inside of their lives are like, and I want to see us flesh that out more today as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. In today's spotlight, I want to turn to injustices. Webster defines injustice this way, quote, lack of fairness or justice, an unjust act or occurrence, the quality or fact of being unjust, inequity, violation of the rights of others, unjust or unfair action or treatment, an unjust or unfair act, close quote. Well, that's a whole lot of unjust. How do we correct an injustice? Jason Van Dyke was sentenced to nearly 7 years for murdering Laquan McDonald. Mr. Van Dyke was the first Chicago police officer in decades convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting. He shot Laquan 16 times in 2014. Is less than 7 years imprisonment for murder really justice? Rodney King was awarded $3.8 million in damages in compensation for his beating by police officers in 1991. L.A. erupted into angry riots over the King beating and subsequent acquittal of 4 of the officers involved. Did the money make things right? Did the riots settle some score? Again, how do you compensate? How do we get true justice? Gustavo Perez Arriaga shot and killed Ranil Singh, a 33-year-old officer with the Newman Police Department, early on December 26, 2018. Arriaga, a 32-year-old undocumented immigrant, was charged with homicide, and 7 of his friends who hid him were also arrested. The county sheriff blames California sanctuary laws for the shooting. Officer Singh left behind a wife and young son. How is justice to be served in this situation? Injustices occur every day, and not just in the areas of criminal justice. How do we correct them, or do we? Some argue that many injustices are not possible to correct in this world, and this is why the afterlife is so important. But what if you don't believe in an afterlife? Is injustice just a part and parcel of life? the best you can hope for is that you're not personally affected? This past weekend, I watched the Saints-Rams game. By now, everyone must know about the non-call that cost the Saints the game, in all probability. Everyone knows that the failure to call a flagrant pass interference and personal foul, helmet-to-helmet hit, made it possible for the Rams to get the ball back and kick a field goal in overtime. Every football pro out there that I have heard has the odds that the Saints would have won the game had the call been made at 98 to 99% because of where the foul occurred on the field and the amount of time that was left. There are now at least 2 class action suits that have been filed against the NFL and the referees directly involved. I'm sorry, but for me, when I see the replay of this flagrant hit, one that the Rams player himself says was intended to be an interference call, but would at least save a touchdown. And I watched the 2 officials who were right there watching the entire thing. I guess my suspicion, my paranoia, my something says I have to wonder how much money they made on the game. How do you miss that call? So how do you set this right? Now, think of the Rams players, and imagine you were a boxer in a fixed fight. You win, but discover the fight was fixed. Not your fault, but doesn't this fact contaminate your victory? The win is tarnished in the fog of controversy. How do you set that right? Injustice is a frustrating aspect of our lives, unfortunately. It would be nice if it were different. We can all work to improve matters for everyone, and we should make our voices heard when we become aware of injustice. But we must also accept that some injustices cannot be set right. That said, if we collectively ignore our responsibility, the next time we may well be on the receiving end of injustice, and there will be no voices there to make our case. My thoughts, what are yours, Ravinder?
You know, you're totally correct. There are some injustices that simply cannot be set right. With all the money in the world, with all the public support in the world, you know, you can't bring someone back. You can't give them back their time when they've been wrongly jailed, and there are plenty of those stories. I do think we all have an obligation to demand fairness, though. So just because you can't fix something doesn't mean that you don't try. I think that the very act of trying to fix something, I think it brings awareness to the whole thing, and it helps prevent it from happening in the future. So, there's times that you can only do the very best, but we all have an obligation whenever we see injustice anywhere to do whatever we can to change it. And it isn't about fixing the past, it's about helping the future.
I totally agree. On the other hand, I think we also need to hold context in mind and be a little slower in our approach to judging what we see as injustices.
Oh, absolutely.
Until we have all the data, all the information, etc. All right, every week I read some of your letters as our way of involving you while paying respect to the very important role you play in making this show successful. Last week, our show featured Dr. Ralph Lewis, and we discussed his work and book, Finding Purpose in a Godless World. Why we care even if the universe doesn't. Keith wrote, I like Dr. Lewis's pragmatics, as you termed it, but I don't see how we can possibly find comfort or peace in the idea that this is it. We're destined to nothingness. Elizabeth wrote, I wonder what he tells a patient when they lose a child. I imagine it would be something like, well, now the child's atoms can become mixed with many other something else's. That's an interesting perspective. Richard commented, I really like this guy. Brian remarked, I'd like to see Dr. Lewis participate in the development of a protocol and audit the rigor of a remote effect experiment, just to see if any experiment on this topic could meet his expectations. Then again, I have a feeling if the experiment proved remote effects, he would immediately look for the faults in the protocols and execution. You know, I actually had a conversation with Ralph about that, and, the bottom line is, if we have a preconceived idea, and that is there is no evidence for, mind at a distance, et cetera, it is going to, for all intent and purposes, predispose how we view whatever you can call, in quotation marks, evidence that might challenge that perspective. Moving on, Bob wrote, I just wanted to send you an update on my wife's progress with stage 3 breast cancer. A couple of months ago, I purchased 2 audio files from you, one on building a powerful immune system and the other, freedom from nausea. You were also kind enough to send us your free cancer CD. My wife started chemotherapy 17 days ago. She just had her second treatment. She has had only very mild nausea for only a couple of days after each treatment and has not had any problems with eating. The best news is that the tumor in her breast and the tumor in her lymph node have shrunken dramatically. She is confident, relaxed, and doing very well. Thank you once again for the positive impact your InnerTalk programs have had on my life and are now helping to give my wife the best mental and emotional approach to her cancer. Well, thank you, Bob, for your feedback, and our prayers are with you, your wife, and your loved ones. Okay, that's all the time we're going to take for letters today, but we do love your comments, so please keep them coming. You can opine by writing to me at Eldon, that's Eldon, at eldontaylor.com, or by joining me on Facebook at Dr. Eldon Taylor. We do sincerely appreciate your thoughts and ideas. Now to today's show. To protect and serve, how to fix American police, with author, former chief, Professor Norm Stamper. His Amazon book copy states this, quote, the police in America belong to the people, not the other way around. Yet millions of Americans experience their cops as racist, brutal, and trigger-happy, an overly aggressive, militarized enemy of the people. For their part, today's officers feel they are under siege, misunderstood, unfairly criticized, and scapegoated for society's ills. Is there a fix? Today's guest believes there is, so let me tell you a little about him. Professor Stamper was a police officer for 34 years, the first 28 in San Diego, his last 6 as Seattle's police chief. He has a Ph.D. in leadership and human behavior and is the author of 2 books, Breaking Rank, a top cop's expose of the dark side of American policing, and To Protect and Serve, How to Fix Americans' Police, the subject of today's show, although they are both great books, and I may well ask him questions derived from both. He is currently at work on a novel, a trilogy. He has served as an adjunct professor of San Diego State University, adjunct professor at the University of California, San Diego, and adjunct professor at the University of Washington. So on that, let's get him in here. Welcome to Provocative Enlightenment, Professor Norman Harvey Stamper.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
It's indeed my pleasure. Now, I'm certain of this one. There are many more professors than there are chiefs. Do you want me to call you professor or chief?
My preference, Eldon, would be Norm.
All right. Well, okay, Norm. We like to know 3 things on this show. Who is the messenger? What is the message? And, of course, how do we use it? To that end, tell us what you're passionate about. And when did you decide to expose the dark side, if you will, of law enforcement?
I am most passionate about a theme you identified earlier, and that is justice, basic fairness. And I came to my aha moment in police work after my rookie year, when a principled prosecutor in San Diego kind of slapped me upside the head and asked me if the United States Constitution meant anything to me. I had given him an arrest report, suggested that he probably wanted to dismiss a case that that had been set for trial, and he asked me, why would you want to do that? And I said, well, because it was, and we hemmed and hawed and beat around the bush quite a bit before I got to this truth. And I said, because it was a bad arrest, kind of a euphemism for a false arrest. And that's when he posed that question of me. And from that moment on, having asked myself, my gosh, how did I travel down this road in my first 14 months on the job as a rookie cop, and came to some conclusions and raised probably more questions than I answered, but it really did set me back on what I consider to be the correct path.
Interesting. It's one of the things that every law enforcement individual I've ever known, and I spent years running lie detection examinations, tries to bear in mind is it's not their job to determine guilt or innocence. It's their job. That's the job of the judge and the jury. That's the job of prosecutors to decide. Your job is simply to enforce the law. And yet, there are always those compromises where you just feel that it's not possible to serve justice and be that blindfolded. You experience that, Norm?
I absolutely did experience it, certainly during my rookie year, and came to the conclusion that the power that I had been given, not the authority, because that gets to the sanctioned right to order the actions of other people, but the power that I assumed as a police officer had gone straight to my head. We have a term in police work called badge heavy, and I certainly do confess here and now, as I've done previously, that I became badge heavy. I started abusing the very people I had been hired to protect and serve. And, the question is, well, why? Why in the world would I abuse the position? And not to mention the people that I had been hired to protect. And the short answer is I had never felt anything like the power of a police officer. I grew up in I guess the popular term for it would be a dysfunctional family. My father was brutal, both emotionally and physically. And I had set out to be as different from that man as I could possibly be, and then I came to the realization, after this little dust-up with the prosecutor in the hallway of the San Diego County Courthouse, that I was more like my father than I cared to admit. And that sent me on a trail of research to find out how my father was raised. And I learned an awful lot about that from one of his brothers, my uncle, and learned, really not to my surprise, that my father had been treated pretty much the same way he treated me. One of the sources of pride in my life as an adult of advancing age is that I never treated my son that way. We have a wonderful relationship, and I'm needless to say, pleased to say that I never accused him of being worthless. I never struck him. One little pat to the butt when he was about 4 years old. I regret that. He doesn't remember it. But my deliberate decision was to make sure that I broke the cycle of violence in our family, and I'm proud to say that I did do that.
Boy, can I ever identify with that, but that's another story.
Many of us can, Eldon. I think many men in our society, many women in our society, live with it, see it, in some cases just every day for most of their lives.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
You heard today's spotlight, sir. What are your thoughts on injustice, and do you think we'll ever be able to eliminate them, or what what sort of attitude should we have regarding that?
Well, let me, if I may, agree
Please.
with you that was an unjust non-call in the Rams-Saints game, and I totally get that. But that's football, and both parties. Well, all parties to that particular non-call go on to live another day. And all too often in law enforcement, where there is an injustice, let's say perpetrated at the hands of police, sometimes the outcome is fatal. Sometimes the outcome is incarceration, unjustifiable incarceration. So I think we need to be no, my bias would be let's look at forms of injustice that are not mere irritations, but rather profound in their consequences, and that's what I took from that opening session, which I thoroughly enjoyed because I couldn't agree more. I think what were these two officials thinking? Were they daydreaming? You suggested maybe another much more serious take on it, but I guess I would come back to the idea it's a football game.
Yeah, well, and that's good. I don't know. I think because of backgrounds, we look at things, and I tend to look for motive, and I know you would do the same thing. So I don't mean to imply that they really, were bribed or had bets or wagers or something, but it sure looks like it. Anyway, I just said, let me start this way if I can. About a year ago, my two sons and I had a vigorous discussion, and it was all about black lives and blue lives, and they both live in Seattle. They're students who are graduated from the University of Washington. They tend to see law enforcement in the most negative of lights, and of course I tend to see it differently. But they pushed me. They wanted me to write a book and flesh out, this whole kind of conversation we had. And it began this way. I explained to them what the life of a cop is. I mean, some of the frustrations they deal with. We can't go into them all on the air, but, vomit in your automobile or all over the front of you, spit at, cussing, rocks thrown at you, family fights you respond to, a woman being beaten by her husband, the woman turns on you, bites you, attacks you, or some of the revenue frustrations. You're out serving bench warrants on FTAs as opposed to chasing the really bad guys. And you're doing all this for low pay, and, even routine traffic stops can be just really nasty. I mean, the life a law enforcement officer lives with, I don't think the public generally understands. Flesh that out for us, please, Norm. What is it like to just be a cop?
Well, let's start with a very basic premise that I think most people, regardless of their political orientation, regardless of their even their experiences with law enforcement, would agree that the job itself is very delicate, very demanding, and too often dangerous. So let's accept that as truth. That police work can break your heart. Police work can fundamentally change your life, whether you're on the receiving or the giving end, so to speak, of law enforcement activities. So let's accept the fact that it's delicate, it's dangerous, it's demanding, and often the very things you're talking about do happen to police officers. Pretty much everything you talked about happened to me at one point or another in my career, mostly, obviously, as a patrol officer. But let's accept that as fact, and then ask ourselves, what are we doing to reduce the danger? What are we doing to increase job satisfaction and morale? What are we doing to impress upon our police officers that, given the difficulty of the job, you still must maintain your commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. You must still ensure that your own behavior as a police officer is lawful, is constitutional. And if you happen to entertain notions of prejudice of any type, you've got to figure out a way, not just to suppress it, but to change it so that you do not come across in your enforcement practices or your public service duties and responsibilities as racist or sexist or misogynist or brutal or heavy-handed or trigger-happy. you have an obligation to conduct yourself as a professional against all of these behaviors that you so aptly described. And that gets to the selection process. It gets to what we pay our cops. It gets to the working conditions, their education, their training, their equipment, their supervision, everything about the organization of American policing needs to be questioned. And from my point of view, after 34 years in the business and an additional 18 or 20 reflecting on those years in police work, we got to figure out how most effectively to convince our officers that they must conduct themselves as professionals and be rewarded as such. So it's a major systems challenge, I think, that we face. I have zero against police officers. People say, well, my guy, you were a cop for 24 years and you have such, in some cases, scathing criticism. Yeah, you're right, I do. Laquan McDonald was murdered. Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, was a victim of a cold-blooded murder at the hands of a police officer who wore a uniform very similar to one that I wore, and that almost 1 million police officers wear today. So we have to, I think, call it the way we see it. We have to acknowledge that excessive force and corruption, sexual predation by people in uniform, and other offenses committed by police officers are real. And that kind of tiptoeing around that reality doesn't serve, the cause of what I would consider to be meaningful police reform. Treat cops well, pay them well, and insist that they behave effectively, efficiently, and constitutionally.
Amen to all of that. And when I started to do the research, and fortunately I don't have to pursue it because you wrote the book and I consider it to be definitive, I was surprised to see just what the statistics have to say about the other side. I mean, for example, I was shocked that, on average, 4 police officers are arrested for felonies every single day. That number just amazed me. I mean, it's higher than the average, than our population on a percentage basis. But when we get back, we have a hard break here. We'll pick it up and we'll discuss both sides now from a standpoint of how they're perceived by each other. Law enforcement and society towards law enforcement. We are speaking with Norm Stamper, former Chief of Police of Seattle, about his work and book. It is a great book, To Protect and Serve, How to Fix American Police. It's straight up, does not pull punches, is not biased in one way or another. I highly recommend this book. You can learn more about our guest by visiting his website at Norm Stamper. That's Stamper, normstamper.com. Okay, do please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Change has never been easier. Whether you wish to lose weight, stop smoking, build better relationships, become creative, enjoy ultra prosperity, or simply relax and promote self-healing, InnerTalk has been repeatedly demonstrated effective in the most rigorous of scientific studies. Our customers love InnerTalk. Sean wrote, I have struggled with bulimia for over 30 years and have never been able to lose weight without restoring to it until I used InnerTalk. Vicky wrote, my hubby has been using the Stop Snoring CD and already his dangerous and raucous snoring levels have stopped. Celeste wrote, I recently graduated from Taft Law School with honors. I'm writing to tell you how much your InnerTalk CD, Excel in Exams, has helped me. With over 300 titles to choose from, there is something for everyone. Check it out today by going to innertalk.com.
Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, we're chatting with former chief. You know, it's hard for me. I'm sorry, Norm, not to just say Chief Norm Stamper. But we're speaking with Norm Stamper about his working book, To Protect and Serve, How to Fix American Police. You can learn more about our guest by visiting his website at normstamper.com. All right, every week we ask our guests for their favorite music that has some real meaning to them. Music psychology, as you know by now, is an avocation of mine, and it's a field of research with practical relevance in many areas, including intelligence, creativity, personality, and social behavior. Now, your chosen music today, Norm, is Confidential by Sunny Night. Tell us, please, why is this music important to you, and how does it inform us about who you are?
Well, for me, it's just a form of pure pleasure. It evokes such memories of my childhood at a time when I was, apropos of our comments earlier, beginning to stand up to my father's abuse and trying to find my way in life. It's from the mid-'50s, and it's out of the doo-wop era. I mean, I love classical music. I love jazz. I love particularly what I call East Coast jazz. But this one just has a special place in my heart because I think it does represent a period of time when I was beginning to assert my personhood.
And you're going to be somewhere between 14 or 16, according to the data on our favorite music, and it's going to be attached maybe to some pretty girl, right or wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was probably Doris.
All right. Let's pick it up where we left off. Let's start off this way. There's a perceptual problem, one that began many years ago. And I think to understand the problem, we have to know how we got here. So, I mean, we argue about Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter when clearly both matter. But Chief, this all started a long time ago. To that end, how did we get here?
We got here, I'm convinced, from my studies and from the sort of expert observations of so many researchers over the years, over the decades. Police today are an extension. One might say they operate on a direct line from the days of the slave patrols. And a lot of white cops do not want to hear that. They will say to you, as they've said to me, that's just crazy. That's just nonsense. My daddy and my daddy's daddy and my daddy's daddy's daddy, and go back as far as you want, never owned slaves. How can you saddle us or this institution of American policing with that kind of baggage? And for many African Americans, conversations over the dinner table, generation after generation after generation, have been sort of depressingly predictable. Talking about unlawful search and seizure, stop and frisk, excessive force, and, of course, the conversations about controversial police shootings from Michael Brown in Ferguson to, once again, Laquan McDonald or many, many others.
Right.
And for white families around the dinner table, that's not the conversation. There's never been a sort of a golden age of policing where the old cop on the beat with whom you had this wonderful, trusting relationship within the black community. There are clearly exceptions, and I footnote everything I have to say with those exceptions are important and positive relations and good feelings between white cops and black citizens need to be celebrated and appreciated. But for too many African Americans in this country and others of color, and for sexual minorities and anyone who's different, who's had an unpleasant experience or had unpleasant experiences passed along to them from one generation to the next, their reality is different. You mentioned perception, and of course it goes without saying that the consequences of perception are always real. regardless of the facts, the consequences of my perception and yours are always real. So I think if we could, in law enforcement, accept the fact that we have a large segment of our community that does not see it the way the average middle-class white American family sees it, and just accept that that's a truth for them, and begin to go to work on altering the perceptions. And I lay out a prescription. My agenda for police reform is rather radical. It calls for fundamental reform in the institution, sort of based on my belief that tweaking it and tinkering with the system has not worked, never has worked, and is very unlikely to work in the future, so that what's needed is really profound change.
And I mean, I think you make that case very, very well in your book. You have triggered a couple of thoughts in my mind, though, and I kind of want to go there. Many of our law enforcement officers today, someone in their family was in law enforcement, and that's what propelled them to law enforcement. And if you go back and you think, well, if you had an officer today who was 30 or 40 years old and say his father was a law enforcement officer, well, then that probably means that they were law enforcement officers in the 30s, the 40s, even the 50s, and they would have used the N-word as just a part of culture and on and on. And all of that creates a kind of implicit bias that, whether we want to recognize it or not, we carry and bring forward with us. And that is part of the whole problem. And did I get that right?
I think you did. Whenever you hear a police officer today say something like, "I don't have a racist bone in my body," that's the point at which I say to myself, "Oh, yes, you do." And it may be that you are complicit in systematic racism. You may be telling yourself, "I never use the N-word. I just don't see color," is another thing you hear often. I say, why is it that you don't see color? I certainly see color. I see my whiteness. I see another's blackness or brownness. I see differences, and instead of chalking them up to deficits, I see them as really a condition that we need to celebrate in this country. We are multicultural. We are pluralistic. We are a democracy. And it seems to me that appreciating differences between and among us is a way of celebrating those differences and moving towards something resembling an authentic partnership between, for example, a white cop and a black community. But it does require a stretch for many, I think, in law enforcement.
And I've never known a law enforcement officer that didn't profile, that wasn't inclined to profile, that didn't look at his environment and assess threat. And there's just no way to avoid that in law enforcement, is there, Chief?
I think not only is there no way to avoid that, I think it does challenge us to recognize, we use that term profile, I think, in a lot of ways, but the sort of customary definition or acceptance of a particular definition is that we're engaging in unlawful discrimination. We're stopping people simply because they're black or because they're young or because of this, that, or the other sort of status or condition that we're able to see, that we observe. But it becomes, I think, critical for police officers to recognize that and this is something that just doesn't get talked about nearly enough in my view, that if we see differences and we're ignorant about those differences, we're ignorant of the cultural implications, we become frightened. And I think I've said this before in both of my books. I've said it to police officers, generally acknowledged by police officers to be true, not all police officers, and that is if we come across in our daily activities an African American man, a big man, a dark African American man, we're more likely to be afraid of that person than we are a white person under those same circumstances. That kind of primitive fear really results in enormous problems for the community-police relationship, of course, but also for that specific interaction. So I think the darker a man is, the bigger a man is, the greater the fear on the part of police officers. Now, here's where we get into real interesting conversations with cops, and they'll say, you know, I can talk about that in the locker room. I can talk about that, in a bar or a tavern, but I'm not going to talk about that in my official world. I'm just not going to because, number one, I'm not afraid. It may, in fact, be an unconscious fear. But I think it's vital that we recognize that too often police officers see differences and impute, not impute, but they experience fear in the face of those differences.
Right, and I'm going to explore that, but you have me thinking about another level of fear. I want to switch the channel a bit and think of the opposite side. Let's take James Comey example. In his book, Higher Loyalty, he implies very directly that some of the black crime in America that is escalating in areas are due to the fact that law enforcement is reluctant, that's a good word, fearful of going into these areas because, well, that might be the next scene of something that goes down that costs them their career, involves a shooting, puts them in the press, they're hated by everybody, it could be, and so law enforcement is withdrawing some of the support that they might otherwise provide, say, in a white community. Do you see that as something that's actually occurring in our society today in some areas?
I do, and I really appreciate the qualifier you added there at the last, and that is in some areas, in some police officers, some jurisdictions. I don't think there's any question about it. Comey and others have referred to it as the Ferguson effect. Right. That one incident that got so much attention, and I think for obvious reasons, has produced fear in the minds and hearts of some police officers such that they start engaging in what's called de-policing. So they see something suspicious, they don't intervene. They see somebody getting hurt, they maybe drive the other way. They make a U-turn when at 3 o'clock in the morning they should be driving down that alley and confronting suspicious activity. So I think that's a reality. To deny it, I think, is foolish. At the same time, I think we need to recognize how it is that phenomenon has developed. But I've heard from police officers who say, you think I'm going to risk my life or my job, my career, by confronting this individual? Well, police officers are hired to protect and serve. The better the relationship they have with the community, the less fear they experience, the more confidence and maturity that they bring to the job, the greater the possibility that they'll be able to do all aspects of the work, including those aspects that, services that people don't want, like getting a traffic citation for reckless driving or being arrested for a criminal offense. So I come full circle when I get into that argument with police officers. I concede that there is a Ferguson effect, and I also believe that it's not nearly of the magnitude that most critics, I think, would argue.
And let me look at yet another angle. That's the role of society. Society generally looks at these events like a spectator would at a ball game, and so we have two things, in my view, that go on, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I surely want you to correct me if you see it differently, but First, we have the press rushing in and jumping to conclusions, and then we have the infamous examples like hands up, don't shoot. And that fabrication gets spread around all over the news, and pretty quick we have congressmen standing up, hands up, don't. And this is something that just never happened. The public sees this and they begin to become involved. It stirs them up, and even when it's corrected or they find out it's way past, it's too late to make that correction. And then we have this other side of the public that will not get involved. They didn't see anything. They're not going to talk to you. They're going to turn their backs on you. They weren't there. They're not going to cooperate in any way. They're not going to watch out for their neighbor. Their neighbor's burglarized in broad daylight and they were home, but hey, that's none of their business. How do we correct that if I've got this right, Chief?
I think, certainly by degrees you have all of it right. And you won't find me disagreeing with anything you said. That phenomenon, I think, is present. It's been around for a long, long time. It's a multidimensional phenomenon. But let's assume this. Let's assume that I'm an 18-year-old African-American who's been proned out, which is to say forced to the asphalt by a police officer who thinks that I be a danger to him, when in fact I'm not. When I have not engaged even in suspicious activity, much less criminal activity. And I have that experience, and then I have another similar experience, and a friend has a similar experience. We reach a point where it's impossible for us to trust the police. So let's assume that something does happen in my neighborhood, and I know that what's happening is wrong, and I believe that somebody should help, that we have a victim of, let's say, a violent crime here, and maybe I know who did it. But if I don't, I'll make you the police officer, Eldon. If I don't trust you, what are the odds that I'm going to come to you with my information, that I'm going to be a good witness? They're next to nil. So right. I think we once again, if we want to look at the big picture, have to understand why there is so much mistrust of law enforcement in our communities, and why there's such great polarization. I can't go a whole hour without saying we've got a man in the White House who has urged police officers to commit crimes. We have a man who has encouraged police officers to hit people in the face, to not be too kind or too gentle. This is the leader of our country making these statements. So the polarization grows deeper and deeper. That rift, that divide between community and police grows ever wider. And I think what's needed, what's so essential now, is for cooler minds to prevail, for people to look at how we bridge gaps, not create them. And I'm convinced, I've got an 8-item agenda, as I said earlier, and without getting into a whole lot of detail, I would just say 3 things. One, I think we need to end the drug war. And you say, what's that got to do with police-community relations? And the answer is a ton. Maybe that's for another time and place. But we need to end the drug war. We need to set national standards for stop and frisk, search and seizure, use of force. National standards. Licensed police officers, based on their ability to meet those standards, certify agencies on their ability to meet those standards, and then decertify and yank licenses of agencies or individuals who can't or won't play by the rules. And those rules are found in the Constitution. Then finally, we need to create an authentic definition of community policing. And that does, in fact, put the community in the driver's seat on police policies and procedures, certainly on police oversight. I could but won't go on and on. I think that these blue ribbon commissions and task forces and the like that have been created to study the police-community relationship have come up with great ideas, but they're not being implemented, and the reason they're not, I'm convinced, is that the solution lies in a structural arena, not cosmetic public relations versions of improving community police relations. In my speech right there.
Chief, I'm going to have to cut you off. We're out of time. I'm going to, all of you out there, go get a copy of this book, To Protect and Serve, How to Fix America's Police. The more you know about it, the more involved you are in it, the better we all are in improving the quality of our lives and the community we live in. I want to thank you for your work. Chief, I'm sorry, I just got Chief stuck in my head.
Chief is just fine, Eldon. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Norm. And I really personally appreciate everything you have to say and the book you've written. We've come to the end of another episode of Provocative Enlightenment. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our show, and will join us again next time, same place. And do tell your friends. Let's have them join us as well. Until then, wherever you are in the world, remember, believing in yourself always matters.
Provocative Enlightenment has been brought to you by Progressive Awareness Research and other sponsors. Provocative Enlightenment is a syndicated show and appears on other networks. For a schedule of show times, visit provocativeenlightenment.com. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, write to Eldon at eldontaylor.com.